So this is Speedway Jeff and LilWilly from LilWilly's Record Shelf, so I'm already stumbling over my words, for A to Z Radio. And we have Greg Renoff, author of a couple books, one Van Halen Rising, about the band Van Halen, and then another one, autobiography of
Ted
Templeman,
Yep.
Who is producer extraordinaire.
Yeah, thanks for guys for having me on. I'm really looking forward to talking about both books and whatever you guys want to talk about.
Okay. Well, I think I'm leading off. We're going to hand it off in the middle. I'm actually going to take possibly a different avenue than you've probably asked, because I'm a librarian by trade, so I'm more interested in the book and the publishing part of it.
And I'm a historian by trade. We are natural partners.
Excellent. So the one thing that caught me is, because I've read both the books, the fact that the Van Halen Rising was like written in third person, and then you turn to the Ted Templeman book, and that's first person.
Right.
How hard was that transition?
It was not easy, actually. That's a really good question. The thing I kind of had going for me was, like, if you were going to write a book about Billy Crystal, people have an idea of how Billy Crystal talks, right? Everyone knows, like I said, Billy Crystal voice in their mind. You know, with Ted, because he's a person who hasn't done a lot of interviews, you know, I had a little bit of an easier time that I wasn't trying to, like, hit that imaginary or that real voice in the book. You know, I wanted to try to capture Ted's, the way Ted talked and the way Ted described things, but it wasn't, I didn't have a ton of pressure on it. But getting back to your original question about the switching, it was difficult. You know, I think one of the things that's interesting for me as a historian and a writer, I had to psychologically believe it, meaning that I could do it, meaning that, like, I'm going to do this voice of Ted in the book. And again, I just mean, like, write it as if Ted is saying it and pull that off. Now, again, you know, Ted sent me tons of emails with information, and we talked and did long interviews, but you can't just type up somebody talking to you and make that a book. And so everything was based upon, you know, my conversations with Ted from one extent to another, and then kind of buttressed with research that I did to sort of, like, oh, you know, obviously Ted might not remember when a certain album hit top 10 in 1976, so I would go back and kind of backfill that in there. But you know, it was a challenge, and I was definitely at first sort of, you know, I had to kind of find my footing with it. Once I sort of, like, okay, I got to do this. I got to embrace the Ted Templeman character, for lack of a better term. It went okay.
Good. And that kind of my follow-up to that, and then we can go back to the Van Halen book, was how did you go about having, because you have to eventually corroborate on the stories that Ted tells you, meaning you got to track down somebody to usually track down somebody to say, okay, what really happened?
Right.
How hard was that, or was that something you had to really pursue?
Well, you know, I had an asset, which is that Ted's longtime engineer, Don Landy, who I had worked with Ted first in 1968 when Ted was an artist, going up through 1984, the Van Halen album. You know, he was a great resource for me. He was super supportive of the book and was very generous and, like, basically, like, helping me in any way he could. He provided pictures for the book, so people want to check out some never before seen photographs of not just Ted, but some of the artists Ted produced, like Little Feat and Van Halen, working in the studio that Don Landy, their engineer, took. They're really amazing pictures. But, you know, a lot of times I could go to Don and be like, how do you remember this? And he might remember it differently, and I could go back to Ted and kind of, you know, sometimes that, you know, was able to find where they had sort of diverged and sort of maybe trying to go to a third source, like a Billboard article or something, to try to find out. But, you know, to have that there, a lot of times Don could basically put in information that Ted didn't remember, and then it was paid for a much more full photo. So I photo of Ted in the book. So I have to give a lot of credit to Don Landy, who not only is an amazing engineer, he's a wonderful guy, and was really just an awesome supporter of it. Like, he just, like, you know, had Ted's back all the way on the book and wanted it to be awesome too, you know.
On the subject of Don Landy, the one thing that left me questioning at the end of the book, was there a happy ending between Ted and Don, or is it not to be discussed? Or?
Oh no, they talk by email quite frequently, and they talk on the phone on a regular basis. I mean, like a very regular basis. You know, I think it was definitely after 1984 came out, there was definitely this awkward period where it was difficult. I don't think, you know, either of them had like any sort of like, you know, huge dislike for the other, but it was a very, as you guys can probably tell from the book, it was an ordeal. Like, and it was just one of these things where it's like, everyone should just they should go their separate ways, right? And sort of, from the very beginning, I talked to Ted, and Ted was always singing Don's praises, saying, I couldn't have done it without Don Landy. Those albums never would have been what they were without Don Landy. And that's not saying that to knock the Van Halen, like the Van Halen couldn't have done it without them, but meaning that like it was all of the parts together, especially Don getting the sounds on tape and sort of being such a great collaborator with Ted behind the board. He was always, from the very first time I talked to Ted when I did Van Halen Rising, praising Don up and down. So there never was like any like, it was just sort of, I think, there was that sort of like had a shakeout period where they had to kind of find their way back to being friends again.
That's awesome, because that's one of the few questions I was left with all the information that you provided, because where Jeff read the book, I did the audio book. And while the narrator was spectacular, he actually got me to the point where I was like, okay, yeah, I'm listening to Ted Templeman talk. And it kind of led me into, but then it made the story sound genuine.
Yeah.
He did a great point of sounding genuine, but as it got further where Ted and Don were basically separating, it almost seemed like Ted was hurt and like that may have never gotten mended.
Yeah, it got mended. I mean, I think I think that's totally fair to say. I think Ted was, I think Eddie, from what I was able to kind of gather, I think he really felt as if Ted had missed something with what he was looking for. And I think that, on the flip side, that Ted probably felt that, like, he was trying to be supportive and being helpful. He wasn't trying to be, like, counterproductive in the process. It just was, there was a difference of opinion about things, and there were a lot of, the thing, too, understand that there were a lot of deadlines, a lot of pressure. The one thing I would slip in there for you guys to understand is, like, the middle of that, making that album in 1983, Van Halen did the US Festival. So think about that. So basically, they started working on the album in April, and the album was supposed to come out, like, in September or October. Well, they had, like, all of April, all through May, and then all into June between prepping for the US Festival, and then they had to do the video. They did the Showtime video. We seen those 3 songs that they did for the Showtime special. Like, it was the summer of '83 that came out in the late summer. That they lost all that time. So there were some disruptive things that when they did Van Halen 2, they did it in like 10 days. And basically they mixed it and mastered it. Whereas this was stretched out over a period of long months. So I think a lot of that stuff, kind of the circumstances weren't in the new studio. Just none of those things didn't really lend itself to the most smooth process.
All right, so let's flip over to the research part for like Van Halen Rising, which was totally different because what was over 200 interviews.
Yeah, a lot.
And then I also appreciated the the list of all the sources that you went through, and it seemed like that might have been a little more lengthy process just from having to line up with so many people, or was it about the same amount of time?
No, it was to do the Van Halen Rising book took longer, a little bit longer. I think the Ted book took longer than I expected because Ted had such a lengthy career and had done so many records, and there were so many dates and different pieces of studios that I had to basically either talk to Don about, go back to Billboard magazine, go to other articles, and really newspaper articles to reinforce that stuff. So it took longer than I expected, even though that's not showing up in the sources. There was a lot of like you said, like just basically fact checking, like basically, okay, this is accurate, this is right, and kind of lining that stuff up. But the Van Halen Rising book, I did it with footnotes and stuff, and I really wanted people who read the book. I didn't want people to kind of dismiss it, going, oh, this is just a bunch of stuff this guy just basically like, I wanted people to know that, like, I read all these articles in, like, all these like random, like, Sioux Falls Gazette magazine with some interview from David Lee Roth in 1979 that no one had really used before, 78. I wanted to make sure people understood that I did that research. Not to, like, pat me on the back, but just that the book, to have the sort of weight that I wanted it to be, like, look, it was very closely researched. Obviously there's, like, in any book, there's mistakes in there. There are things like, oh, this whatever. You just, there's things that you go back and you go, I would have worded something differently, or maybe this is not. Now I know something more than I knew at the time, and maybe this is a little bit different than I thought. But it was important to me as a historian and somebody who was coming to rock biography I'd never done a rock biography before, just to be able to people understood, like, this wasn't just something I just, like, sat down and wrote at night over a period of like 3 or 4 months. It's something I worked years on, right? And so that for me, and look, people have said, like, to me, on the Kindle book, the footnotes are so big and everything. I'm just like, well, hey, so be it. To me it mattered because I wasn't, it wasn't like I was like the official Eddie Van Halen historian, or like I was like, somebody who was, basically tasked by the band to do this. I just wanted to make sure people understood I was taking it seriously because I care about the history. I mean, I wanted people to know this is like as accurate as I can make it.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, having read other books and articles about Van Halen, after reading yours, it was more of a, hey, I never knew that about the band. And I think it's because you go so far back. I think people think of Van Halen like, oh, they just showed up on the scene in like 77, 78.
Right.
And they don't understand how far back it goes. And especially how Dave, oh, yeah, we knew that they didn't really want Dave in the band at first, but the whole background.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just a great story of that.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, for me, yeah, well, that's what really gave me the motivation to like want to do this book. I mean, it's snowballed for me from just I might do an article on Van Halen to like I'm going to do this book eventually, and that didn't happen overnight. It happened over a period of months or whatever, like But there was so much stuff. I mean, there was so much. I'm like, holy, like this is amazing. Like this, I didn't know. Like I'm finding all this stuff. Like I didn't know this. I didn't know this. I didn't know this. People telling me these stories, and then I'm talking to 30 or 40 different people in Pasadena who are at the same party, and they're basically all telling me the same similar stories, and I'm like, you know what? There probably is a little bit of myth making that gets over the years. Maybe things get inflated a little bit in people's head, but like you have 35 people telling you that there were 1,000 people at this party, and there was like 25 cop cars, and like the helicopter came. You sort of like it's something that needs to be told properly.
And you did a spectacular job of doing that, I might say.
No, I appreciate that. It's nice of you guys to say that.
I really did enjoy it. Can I bump back to the TED story? Now, you did say there was a lot of emails and interviews. I'm kind of curious about the interviews because as I listened through the book, you almost get the image of like you and Ted sitting in a living room where he might be tinkling the ice in a glass of whiskey or something, telling tales, or whether it was something like you guys sitting across the table.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of that. I spent numerous days out there in Los Angeles with Ted, sitting and talking with him. We did a lot of phone interviews. Like he'd call me, he'd be like, "Hey, can you talk?" Yeah, and I'd hop on the phone with him, and like we would Ted Templeman, of course I could talk. Yeah, I'd love to talk. And I would take the call, and then it would transcribe it, and then so I was basically able to build it out from there. And then there would be a lot of like, we got to go back to this, Ted, and try to remember. And like sometimes Ted would be like, there are things I don't remember. I mean, I'll give you a good example of something that Ted had forgotten about that he told me after the book came out. It's kind of it's just like a little funny thing. So one of the things Ted did in 1990 or so, he worked on the Wayne's World soundtrack. So Ted was basically the producer of the Wayne's World soundtrack. And so obviously there are a lot of songs from like Cinderella and Bullet Boys and all these other artists, Queen, right? So Ted obviously didn't produce Bohemian Rhapsody, but he was the guy who was in charge of putting everything together and getting the album together. He's like, did I ever tell you that I played drums for the Wayne's World movie? And I was like, what? He's like, oh, when Garth plays the drums in the music store? I was like, yeah. He goes, oh, that's me. I was like, what? Wait a minute. It's not in the big. Probably would have been just like a sentence or two in the book, but I'm like, no, you never told me that. That's kind of a cool thing. So yeah, he told me that like, they needed. I don't know what the exact proper movie terminology is, but like, when somebody drops like a glass and it shatters, they have to have a sound guy later like make the glass shattering afterwards, and they record it and then they pop it into the soundtrack, the sound of the movie. And so they needed the drum solo to sound more big for the movie, and so they had Ted played it in the studio. He's like, yeah, I was there, and obviously I was a drummer, and so I played it. So that whole like thing with the lights come on, and he's like, hitting the drums and doing the drum solo in the drum store. That was Ted, and I was like, no, I didn't know that. So I mean, there were always things like that either he had forgotten about that. Sometimes I had to kind of shoehorn in at the end, which was good. I mean, but at some point you have to like cut bait. I had a deadline. It's like we got to wrap this up. It's like, I'm glad you remembered this, but the book is due to the press in like 5 days. I was like, holy crap, I got to like add a paragraph, and it was like it was. But it was, just that he was excited to keep adding things and stuff. But that was something that he forgot. But that's kind of it's like a minor little thing in the big scheme of things. But I was just like, oh, that's kind of a cool thing that Ted played the drum solo that was in the Wayne's World movie. It was Ted on the drums as a drummer.
I think I could speak for Jeff that Wayne's World will never be the same again. Knowing that
you watch it, yeah. I mean, it's just like, yeah, it's and Dana Carvey. He can play drums. I mean, Dana actually is a drummer, so it was much more of like Ted having to mirror what Dana was doing in the movie, basically to kind of reproduce. So they have like basically the very rich, big drum sound they wanted. Like whatever live audio they probably had from the shot wasn't going to sound good enough in the soundtrack of the movie. But yeah, it's interesting, right? He produced the Tia Carrera what was her name in the movie? The female lead. What's her? I can't remember her character's name. What's it?
Cassandra.
Right. So Ted, she did a couple songs. So Ted produced her and stuff. So like, yeah, it's fun stuff like that. I mean, that's he had these great stories.
Yeah, well, we want to respect your time because we know you got to get off to something else.
I got one more, I think.
But just real quick one. Any projects in the pipeline that you can talk about, or what's the next step for Greg Renoff?
Yeah, I have a couple book ideas that I'm toying with. I mean, I think a lot of people can probably relate to the fact that COVID kind of reorganizes your domestic life and reorganized mine with my family, and so I was not able to really dedicate the time I wanted to do a book. I did some articles over the last year. I did some writing for a podcast, which was really kind of fun to do. But yeah, I've got another book or two idea, and I'll get those out into that idea out eventually into a book form. But yeah, I sort of had to take kind of a pause from kind of doing the book. It just wasn't feasible with the way things were.
All right. Well, thanks for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you guys. Appreciate it.